Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa here on France 24 for all the news across the continent. Coming up on tonight's show, the United Nations Food Agency says that 15 trucks carrying food aid have entered Ethiopia's Tigray region on Wednesday. It comes as humanitarian groups gain access for the first time since a ceasefire agreement was signed 2 weeks ago. We speak to the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband, about the latest developments. Then, feeling the effects of its worst drought in 4 decades, Kenya has sought to reintroduce genetically modified crops. But opponents say the latest decision will hurt the growing organic export market, as well as small-scale farmers. And the family of prominent South African anti-apartheid hero Dulcie September are seeking justice in a Paris court. They're calling for France to recognize that it could have done more to prevent the ANC activist's death in Paris back in 1988. Thanks for joining us again. The World Food Programme says its first aid convoy has arrived in Ethiopia's war-torn Tigray region since a landmark peace deal was signed earlier this month. Restoring aid deliveries to Tigray was a key part of the agreement signed in South Africa between Ethiopia's government and Tigray rebels. The populous region has suffered severely throughout the 2 years of brutal war, with mass displacement, a lack of food and medicine, as well as limited access to basic services. To discuss the problems facing post-war Ethiopia, I earlier spoke to President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, Mr. David Miliband.
Your introduction has done a very good job of explaining the challenge in the Tigray region. That's obviously about 7 million people, a high level of conflict, a siege that has denied humanitarian aid for some time, and so obviously the prospect of relief is very welcome. My visit to Ethiopia, though, was in part to highlight that Tigray is not the only part of the country where there are massive humanitarian needs. We, the International Rescue Committee, work in 7 of the provinces of Ethiopia. Tigray is a part of the country where we do have several hundred staff, but we have bigger programs in other parts of the country where tens of millions of people are affected not just by conflict, but by the consequences of long-term climate crisis. Above all, a drought that has been running for the last 5 rainy seasons, denying the rain that's needed. And so my visit to the east of the country was really to try to draw the world's attention through interviews like this to the reality that the price of the climate crisis that's being discussed in the UN conference in Sharm el-Sheikh is being paid today by some of the poorest communities in the world. Just to give you a sense of it, in the east of Ethiopia, in Kenya and in Somalia, our experts think that the drought has cost the lives of 9 million cattle already, and that 35 million people are at the level of hunger marked by the UN's classification system as 3 or 4, with 5 being famine. So you can see immediately that this is really quite a severe and present danger, alongside the importance of following through on the peace agreement as it relates to Tigray.
Well, that's a very good point there, because we're talking about that COP27 summit and how much the climate does affect Africa disproportionately, despite not contributing that much. And now you see Ethiopia fighting on 2 fronts. It's just recovered from war, fighting the climate crisis. Is there a window of opportunity available for it to rescue Ethiopia from this famine?
Well, there's a third front as well, if you don't mind my saying so, which is that the economic consequences of COVID, you've seen that in supply chains being blocked up around the world with rising prices. And of course, the war in Ukraine has had an economic impact as well, driving up food prices, energy prices. And with the rise in interest rates around the world in the richer countries, there's a knock-on effect for poorer countries. So it's a triple whammy, really, for countries like Ethiopia. It's conflict, it's climate, and it's the economic screw being turned by global macroeconomic events. Now, obviously, it's very, very important that conflict doesn't feed on itself. And that's why the peace agreement is so important. But the fulfillment of the peace agreement is even more important. Some of this is in Ethiopia's hands, but some of it is in the hands of the international system as well. And while countries like America have stepped up well to the East African hunger crisis, Europe, the Gulf, have not stepped up yet. If anything, they're using Ukraine as an excuse not to do more, even though Ukraine is, the consequences of Ukraine are part of the driver of humanitarian need in East Africa today. So there are responsibilities at home, as you suggest, inside Ethiopia on the parties to the conflict and to those who are engaged in the economic and political management. But there are also international responsibilities that I think are very important.
In terms of those international responsibilities, are you talking about the likes of funding, or is there something more in terms of a practical solution that you would suggest?
Well, I think funding is important, but other aspects are important too. The funding is obviously partly for short-term humanitarian reasons. I think the more structural issue is that development and climate communities have not done a good enough job of working together. I'm thinking of the mapping of risks, which is done separately on the climate and development front. I'm thinking about innovation on issues like climate resilient agriculture, which has not been invested over the last decade. And I'm also thinking about the adaptation to climate change that's necessary in poorer countries, which has often taken second place to the important issues of mitigation of the climate crisis, the decarbonization of energy systems. So I think across quite a broad front, there are some structural issues that need to be addressed if countries like Ethiopia are to get out of the vicious circle in which too many people are currently trapped.
Well, staying with those points on financing, the European Union on Wednesday announced it would dedicate more than $1 billion in climate funding to help countries in Africa boost their resilience in the face of accelerating global warming. The initiative, launched at UN climate talks along with France, Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark, will combine existing and new programs to prepare for future impacts of a warming world. The funding also includes an EU pledge of $60 million for climate loss and damage already being suffered, a contentious issue at the negotiations in Egypt. Well, after 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons, Kenya recently said it was lifting the decade-old ban on openly cultivating and importing genetically modified crops. The move was championed by the government as a solution to an impeding food crisis, but was slammed by consumer groups and Kenyan organic farmers who worry it will have adverse effects on the economy. France 24's Laurent Berstecker has the story.
Faced with its worst drought in 40 years, Kenya is banking on genetically modified crops to combat food insecurity. The country recently lifted a 10-year ban on GMO imports and production and is now conducting trials for a variety of maize that requires a lot less water to grow.
This maize is able to give at least a harvest even in times of high water stress when there is no rain. So, and also it has the ability to more or less reselect.
But this potential solution to failing harvests also has its share of critics. Several consumer rights and biodiversity groups have condemned the lifting of the ban, arguing that such a critical decision should have been put to a public consultation. The move is also unpopular among organic farmers like Esther Kagai, who says she's been able to keep her harvests healthy using indigenous seeds and low-tech irrigation techniques.
I think what we are lacking in our country is water. Look at the people who have enough water with good seeds, not GMO seeds. They are doing well. They are not hungry.
There are also economic concerns over the ban lift, which will open Kenya up to GMO imports, with many farmers expressing worries over unfair competition by multinational firms.
Family members of assassinated ANC anti-apartheid activist Dulcie September were in a Paris court on Wednesday seeking an apology from the French state. September was living in Paris in 1988 when she alerted local police that her life was in danger. However, authorities failed to prevent her murder. France 24's Nadine Taron and Caroline Dumais explain.
Advocate Yves Laurent, who is representing the September family pro bono, had 20 minutes to convince the Paris court that the French state made a grave mistake 34 years ago. Dulcie September was born here in Cape Town, but she died outside her Paris office in March 1988. To this day, the death of the 52-year-old activist remains a mystery. Dulcie was the African National Congress's chief representative in France, Switzerland and Luxembourg at the height of the apartheid regime's war on the liberation movement. But her death was not classified as an apartheid crime.
France basically aligned its legal position on the one of the apartheid regime in the 1980s. Both countries chose not to recognize this as an apartheid crime. It's nonsense, it's a shame, and it's time for justice to raise the bar.
Dulcie's case file was closed in 1992, but her family hopes that it will be reopened and lead to a fully fledged investigation.
There's no expiry date for us. We still want answers. We still want justice for Dulcie. She did very important work here. She was defending democracy. She was fighting for people who couldn't speak up for themselves. And what did she do to deserve what she got?
Some experts believe that Dulcie could have been targeted because she knew about France's illicit arms trade with apartheid South Africa. The verdict will be heard on the 14th of December.
And just a quick word on the Grammys before we end the show. Nigerian superstar Burna Boy has been nominated for Best International Album for Love Damini. His song Last Last has meanwhile been nominated for Best International Performance. Then Grammy regular Angelique Kidjo's album Queen of Sheba was also nominated. Uganda's Eddie Kenzo and Ghana's Rocky Dawuni have been picked for the Best International Performance category, as well as South Africa's Nomcebo Zikode, who made a name for herself singing on the Master KG hit Jerusalema. And we end the show on a title Bayete, nominated at the Grammys.
Bacela uthule empilweni zabo